We are live.
Okay. Thanks everybody for coming today. It's a pleasure to have so many people here online and in our front row for our first class in this new online course on data and macro development. We have a great lineup of classes that I'm going to just put the schedule on. We have a bunch of lectures that went out in an email, and you may have seen, and we've added 3 since then. I just want to highlight them. We added 3 lectures in June. Meredith Starts is going to talk about primary data collection. Cheryl Doss is going to talk about gender data, and Charles Gottlieb is going to talk about time-use data. And so this course is going to cover a wide range of topics as you see here, and we're delighted to have Pete Klenow be our first speaker. Pete is a professor at Stanford, and he's been one of the leaders of the macroeconomic development field since its since its outset, let's say, and he's made kind of fundamental contributions to this field, including the study of misallocation. He's been also a pioneer in development accounting, and he's going to give us our first lecture today, introducing the course and focusing on development accounting. And so it will be 1 hour of the lecture, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A with the front row. And so for the front row, please just keep yourself muted. You can keep your camera on. Please keep yourself muted, and at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask your questions. You can raise your hand, and then Pete can call on you. And then several of Pete's students are in attendance, and they're going to handle questions in the chat. If you have them, you can ask questions in the chat. Pete, thanks so much for agreeing to give this first lecture. Please take it away.
Okay, thanks so much. First and foremost, let me get my slides up here. Yeah, this is a pleasure. So one thing I wanted to say right at the outset was I would have loved as a graduate student to have this lineup of classes, and especially with the data focus. Data is the lifeblood of research, including in macro development. So this is a really exciting lineup of lectures, and I'm honored to start it off. Okay, so as David said, development accounting is near and dear to my heart, and I'll try to convey to you why I think this is really exciting area of economics right now. Okay, so I'm going to break my hour into 4 sections. Talk at the beginning motivationally about income differences across countries, and then dive into the development accounting, which is trying to attribute those differences in per capita income across countries to differences in capital intensity, capital deepening, capital per worker or per person, and then human capital. And then there's just going to be a technology, TFP residual that might be attributed to technology or other forces, so I'll talk about that. And then as always, we want to keep our eye on the big welfare questions that we're interested in these income differences because they're tied up with big differences in welfare. So I'll talk about those. Okay, so let me dive in. So there's some papers. There's a lot of papers that I'm going to touch on. These are the ones that I'm going to touch on the most, and so I just wanted to have those up front. Francesca Caselli has a really nice handbook chapter on income differences across countries. Rastusha and Rogerson really kind of pioneered thinking about misallocation as a potential source of differences in per capita income in a major way. And then I have some papers with Chang on differences in misallocation issues. Chad Jones and I have something about welfare and GDP. He's got a nice handbook chapter himself that has some of the key facts that I'll talk about as well. And then I have a recent chapter in a new grad macro textbook on growth that has some of the facts I'm talking about. Okay, so let me dive in. So I'm going to be using Penn Rule Table, the most recent version, and just one concept to get out there because I'm going to keep referring to PPP. So at a very broad conceptual level, PPP is just using a common set of prices in the world to value differences in expenditures. So picture in country J, they have expenditures on goods I, and so there's capital I goods. And how do you weight those expenditures? Well, in nominal GDP in a country, we use the country's own prices, but to have parity, meaning to evaluate these expenditures with a common yardstick, they use a common set of prices in the Penworld table. Where do they get those common set of prices? Well, they basically take a weighted average where the weights are the country expenditures on that item. The more countries spend on item I, sorry, the higher the weight on country I's prices. And what that means is that rich countries who have higher expenditures in the typical category, this is just total expenditures, not even per capita, but given their high per capita incomes, they're going to get a lot of weight. So these PPP prices tend to tilt toward rich country prices. And something to keep in mind is that this isn't a perfect yardstick. This is evaluate, like we usually think of looking at marginal utility in the local economy or marginal productivity to value production at the margin. And so then we'd use local prices. But here because those are in different units, we need some common units. And so we use a common set of prices, but there's limits to this. So this why does this tilt? Why does this make poor countries look richer than maybe they are? Is because it's using prices in another country. And so to the extent, or another region and to the extent that in your local economy, you buy more of stuff that's lower price, you're going to tilt your quantities toward the low price stuff. But if you use other countries' prices, those are going to tend to be higher than the ones you face. And so there's going to overvalue, say, for example, food consumption. They'll use rich world prices that tend to be higher for food relative to other items. So arguably overstate income in poor countries and maybe even understate income differences across countries. So that's just a conceptual thing to get out there about what is PPP, and also to keep in mind that when I emphasize these massive income differences, if anything, they might be an underestimate. Okay, so what does this data look like? I'm going to focus almost entirely on the latest year, 2019, in my talk. This is just a handful of countries, but the biggest population countries in the world. I think there are about 20 here. The United States is at the right. We normalize that to 1, or I normalize that to 1 in terms of PPP GDP per capita. And you can see Germany is something like 80% of the US, Japan something like 70%. And then you kind of move down, you have China, something like 1/4 of US per capita income. Go even farther, say India, maybe 1/8. And then if you go all the way down, you see Ethiopia, Congo, numbers like 1/64, 1/32. So truly huge differences in per capita income. So I like to refer to this as the $64 trillion question, because even before I was born, there was some TV show called the $64,000 question. I call this the $64 trillion question because that's the order of magnitude of increase in GDP you'd experience at the world level if you were able to pull up, if governments in these economies were able to pursue policies that allowed their citizens to live at standard of living of the richest countries in the world today, that would be equivalent to adding like 64 trillion. So that's the big question. There are massive differences in income. We think there's massive differences in welfare associated with these because this flows into differences in consumption. I'll talk about broader measures of welfare, but this is the question. To me, arguably the most important question in economics. The biggest welfare stakes are involved in this contrast in figuring out what policies can be pursued to either fix market failures or governments make wiser investments or policy or regulatory choices that could liberate people in the world to enjoy a really high standard of living. Okay, so that's the motivation. The US is a relatively boring in terms of its time series. And so I just put this up for a couple hundred years, partly because it's Chad Jones's favorite plot to illustrate the US is kind of hovering around what looks like a stationary growth path. And then that's just background to say, in the following plot, I've got PPP, GDP per worker here, but it's very similar to per capita, we'll see. And then put it into regions, and then the US is normalized to 1 each year. So I just showed the US plot to kind of convey that the US is growing relatively stably. So the way to think about this is if Europe is catching up relative to the US, they're growing faster than that stable growth in the US. So you can see Europe going from less than 1/2 of US per capita income in 1960 to the end of the sample closer to 80%. So there's some conversions from 1960 to 1980, and then it kind of has been leveled off since then. And you can see Latin America starting at about 1/4 and ending at about 1/4. So there's some fluctuations, sometimes where they grew faster, sometimes where they grew slower in the US, but not a lot of convergence. East Asia is really where you see the convergence, not surprisingly, going from something like 1/16 to almost 1/4 of US per capita income. So a major move. That means East Asia is rising, grew a lot faster over the 60-year period than the 2% growth in the US. So that's convergence led by population weights, led by countries like China and India, but also other countries like Japan, South Korea, and so on. And then you have South Asia. So picture, I guess India isn't here, not in the East Asia example. Here they start 1/16th, fall behind a little bit, and carried somewhat by India, a lot of convergence later to over 1/8 of US per capita income. And then Sub-Saharan Africa starts out about 1/8, actually grows more slowly. So you see divergence here. So this is a nice illustration that there's no law of convergence, that convergence happens over all time periods. That kind of makes sense, because if you always converge, then countries would never gotten this far apart. There must be some forces for divergence at some points in history. And this is an illustration that over a 20-year, 30-year period, 25-year period, there can be some major divergence still. And then you can see that leveling off in the last 20 years or so. Okay, so that showing you some big regional differences in levels, but also in growth paths. Okay, but these relative levels are really persistent. So here's a picture that shows on the horizontal axis per capita GDP in 1960, the vertical axis the same for 2019. The US is normalized to 1 in each year. And so what this plot is demonstrating is that there's movements in the distribution. Anybody above the 45-degree line is ones that got closer, that grew faster than the US. Anything below the 45-degree line is a country that grew slower than the US. You can see on average, there's no tendency to have a lot more mass at the above the 45-degree line than below. So there's lots of countries that fell behind, farther behind the US, and lots of countries that closed in on the US or exceeded them. You can see on the far right, Switzerland. I think Norway might be in there too. All right, so you can see there's lots of persistence. So this phenomenon, when I look in 2019 at big differences in income, those aren't just transitory. Those are very persistent. There's moves throughout the distribution, and those are really interesting to try to relate those to, say, policy reforms in places like China and India. And that's why we're really interested in development accounting, is because it can shed light on policy priorities, which I'll talk about. Okay, this is one plot showing you just the histogram in 3 years, 1960, 1918, 2019. So you can see lots of dispersion in all the years. And you can see the US is again normalized to 1 in every year here. The big thing that jumps out here, to me at least, is the green bars, so that's the latest year, that are having some middle income countries, somewhere 1/8 to 1/4 the US per capita income, whereas the mass used to be lower, between 1/16th and 1/32nd. So think of China and India getting a large population weight and being a major move in the distribution. So that's arguably the best news for world human welfare, is the rapid growth in China and India, because there's so many people there and they started out initially relatively low income. So large growth there arguably had a major impact on welfare. Okay, so again, just broad motivation. Now I want to dive into development accounting. So I'm going to use this production function. It's we think of these applying really to firms and maybe even plants and products, but it's a useful fiction to imagine an aggregate production function. And one can do lots of things with data on heterogeneity, but I'm going to imagine just a simple, for conceptual clarity, just a simple single sector producing a single output good in an economy and using physical capital, equipment, structures, and so on, a certain elasticity alpha, and then there's constant returns to capital and then human capital. H is human capital per worker. L is some measure of labor input. It could be bodies, it could be total hours worked. And then A is a residual. A is just like a plug factor that if we had data on Y, K, little h, and L, and then we had some estimates of alpha, then we could back out a residual A. Okay, so the next step for development accounting is to rearrange this. So just by multiplying and dividing by things, you can express it this way. So I'm going to use this for the development accounting. And then a natural question is, why? Why did I rearrange it this way? So this has capital in an intensive form, so capital relative to output. And the reason many people in macro development prefer this formulation is because the accounting with this expression, like for example, if we said an increase in H, would that cause an increase in capital? Well, if the investment rate was fixed, more H would mean more output, which would eventually mean more investment and eventually more capital. So there's a natural complementarity between the AH and L, which allow you to produce more output, and how much capital is produced. So to hold K fixed while we increase H would be like actually requiring us to reduce the investment rate, which is kind of strange. So what's the contribution of H to Y while at the same time reducing the investment rate? This formulation, K over Y, is influenced by the investment rate, but also things like growth and depreciation. But just think of this as proportional to the investment rate. And so now when we raise H, we're assuming the investment rate is fixed rather than assuming the capital stock is fixed. So I think that's a more reasonable kind of thought experiment to say, basically, we're giving H or labor input or the residual TFP the benefit of the fact that it'll induce more capital accumulation just with a fixed investment rate. So I like it for that reason. Another reason is that H is treated differently here. There's some asymmetry because I'm emphasizing that K is produced by Y. How come I'm not emphasizing that you can produce H with output? Well, the reason is that most estimates say that human capital production is very intensive in human capital. The teacher's human capital, the student's human capital, and time. So this formulation basically builds in some asymmetry that when we increase, say, the investment rate, which increases capital intensity, that wouldn't necessarily automatically mean more human capital. But I'll have more to say on that later in my talk. Okay, before I dive into the numbers, let me say I occasionally get, sometimes from not people outside macro development, why do we care? Why do we care about accounting for differences in income per capita into labor per capita, physical capital intensity, human capital? Why do we care about that? Who cares if human capital contributes 50% of income differences versus 25%? To me, it really does matter. So imagine an analogy where if you said, what does it matter if 50% of people die of heart disease or 25% of people die of heart disease? What does it matter how many people die of cancer versus heart disease versus other ailments? I would say it obviously matters, that it helps us set priorities for medical care and medical research. So similarly, I would say understanding the importance of human capital or physical capital or labor helps shed light on which policies should be a priority to understand. The more important human capital is, the more we need to understand where those differences in human capital are coming from. Are there market failures? Are there government investments that they could make? Are there RCTs that should be run to help us shed light on how to invest in human capital more effectively everywhere? Okay, so I think we really do care about this accounting, and you often see papers on RCTs or on micro development that start off in their introduction motivating what they're studying. Say if they're studying human capital, motivating it by saying, look how important human capital is in development accounting. So there's evidence that it guides research priorities. Then I'm saying it also should guide policy priorities. Okay, with that introduction, let me start talking about some numbers. So the first term, this L over pop, has two components. One we have more data on, which is just bodies, employment per population. And this has PPP per capita on the horizontal axis, base 2 scale, US normalized to 1. And then you've got the employment rate, the fraction of the population working. So you can see it increases slightly with development. There's a lot of dispersion, but the elasticity is very small. So bodies aren't contributing. Rich countries aren't rich, in part because they have so many people working. So you can imagine what this is picking up. This employment measure is picking up a lot of informal market activity. If this was formal sector employment, that would be much more positively sloped, I presume. But we capture in some informal output in GDP, so it makes sense to think about employment in the informal sector as well as formal. And there's just not that strong a relationship. Now, what about the intensive margin? David Lagakos and Alexander Bick and Nicola Fuchs-Schondel have a nice set of papers that look at the intensive margin. I'm just using the Penn World Table data on this. They look at a lot of countries and a lot of time periods. And this is showing, at least in the latest data, there's a small positive slope. Notice there's far fewer countries. We're missing a lot of the countries here. The axis even changed. It used to be, if we go back, it used to be 1 over 128 over here. A lot of countries in this range, the 132nd through 128th of US. And now that's a lot sparser. We just don't have the data on the intensive margin in a lot of developing countries. But where we see it, there is some modest slope, so 3% higher. So what the takeaway I'm going to say from this is that, generously, maybe a 10% difference in per capita income could be attributed to hours worked per capita. But again, that's kind of generous. When I do the numbers, I'm actually going to plug in a number closer to 1.04. But just to be generous and round it, say that it has some role, some minor role. Okay, so what am I doing here? Let me clarify. I'll show you data for all countries a little bit later, but conceptually, it's helpful to just stress factors of difference. So what's the difference between the 90th, 10th, and the 10th percentile country? So I'm leaving out the richest, leaving out the 10% poorest. You still have a factor of 12 difference. not the factor of 64 between the Congo and the United States, but still a factor of 12, and only a little bit of that is coming from the labor margin. Okay, so we're going to be now looking next at the physical capital margin, then the human capital, and then talk about the residual. All right, so physical capital output ratios. A couple outliers, unfortunately, are dominating the picture, places like Qatar. But you see there's just a lot of variation. They range from, a lot of these are around 1 or a little less even. And then at the upper end, numbers like 4. So you picture the capital output ratio varies from 1 to 4 times annual output. So, and there, you can't see it here, but there's a modest positive correlation. So if I do the accounting, I get 40% higher capital output ratio in the 90th percentile country than in the 10th percentile country. Now, that may not seem like a lot because you get a factor of 12, but that's a huge factor of 12. So that 40%, saying you got 40% more income. And so, what does that mean for capital output ratios? Well, as I showed you here, they're differing by a factor of about 4. So why is it only 40%? Well, this alpha is only about 1/3. I'm not doing this justice here. I'm just going to use a common alpha about 1/3, but there's important work by Douglas Gollin and other people that takes into account heterogeneity in alphas across countries, and that just makes it a little trickier to do the accounting. And so and it doesn't play a huge role. So I'm gonna sweep that under the rug for here and have a common alpha. But if you had alpha 1/3, this exponent becomes 1/2. So to get a 40% income differences out of capital output ratio, you need about a factor of 4. A factor of 2 differences in capital output ratio between the 90th and 10th. You have more of a factor of 4 between like the 95th and 5th percentile. Okay, so factor of 2, factor of 4, those are major differences in capital intensity. If you think about there's a factor of 32 difference in income, then a factor of 4 differences in physical capital output ratio means a factor of 128 difference in capital labor ratio. So that means for every dollar someone has physical capital to work with, as a worker in a developing country, they might have $128 in the richest economy. So those are massive differences in capital intensity, and a 40% difference in per capita income attributed to them. That's major. So I don't want to diminish the importance of physical capital, the fact that it's not a big part of the overall story. The overall story is so massive that physical capital can be really interesting, even though it looks like it's not the main part of the story. Okay, so I think that's really interesting, and let me spend a little bit of time saying, the accounting I'm doing is proximate accounting. This isn't deep accounting, like what are the policies or institutions that contribute to these differences. That's where you need more research, and where a lot of the talks are going to be talking about diving into different parts of the economy, different types of workers, a lot of heterogeneity. So I'm excited to see the next lectures, because like the students watching this, I'm going to learn a lot. I know some of it from other people's work, but I'm going to learn a lot from it. That's where you're diving in and understanding more of not only the heterogeneity within economies, but maybe the policies that are impacting these things. So think of this accounting as proximate accounting. And there's some deeper accounting that we can do, but this is an interesting, just in the same way that once we do the accounting of saying how many deaths are due to heart disease, then we want to do deeper work saying where is this heart disease coming from? What policies and behaviors are contributing to that? Okay, so I'll do a little bit next layer, proximate, ask proximate. It doesn't say where a difference in savings rates or prices are coming from, but a next layer of proximate accounting is saying, of this capital output ratio differences, is it rich economies have higher savings rates, and that's plowing in domestic investment rates? Is they face lower investment prices? That's a no. They do have higher savings rates. Rich countries don't have lower investment prices. Do they have higher consumption prices? Yes. And I'm going to argue about why that might contribute briefly. Okay, so here's the investment rate at domestic prices. You can see rich economies are way up here. They have investment rates of 20 to 30%. And this is at domestic prices, meaning just nominal investment rate divided by nominal GDP. And you can see it's higher. That's consistent with maybe higher savings rate plowing into higher investment rates domestically in rich economies relative to poor economies. So that's part of the story. But is equipment cheap? Because you might have imagined equipment is predominantly produced in like a few countries. Like a lot of the equipment in the world is produced in Japan and Germany and places like that, increasingly China. And as a result, many countries are importing their equipment. If many developing countries are importing it rather than getting it locally, maybe it's more expensive. Not just tariffs, but transportation costs and so on. the data doesn't go that way. It used to be flat. This is one of the things that was fun about doing this, preparing for this talk, is that I was updating some figures that I had calculated before, and some of the facts have changed. So that's kind of nice. John Maynard Keynes, I think, had some great quote about, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do to somebody? So yeah, this used to be flat. Now it's more upward sloping. So if anything, it's saying it's puzzling that rich countries have more capital because if anything, investment is more expensive for them. I'm a little bit skeptical about this positive slope. I'm wondering whether it might reflect unmeasured quality differences, but at least as a superficial take, it's not a contributor. Okay, consumption prices are higher in rich economies too, and to a greater extent. Think of Blasa-Samuelson, which is like tradable stuff gets prices that are more similar, and non-tradable stuff like consumption services, those have bigger differences in prices. So this is being carried by differences in service prices. So think about taxis are cheaper in developing countries than in rich economies. Now, why does that matter for capital? Well, think about if you're buying a piece of capital, you care about how much that costs. Well, if anything, that's expensive in rich economies in this previous plot. But you also care what price do you sell the output that you make with this. So these high prices for these non-tradable consumer services are inducing more capital accumulation in those sectors than if you got a low price, say, in a developing country. So the fact that a bunch of the output prices are low relative to rich economies is actually disincentivizing accumulation of capital. What this means is that if these countries had, developed farther in the sense of pushing up consumer service prices, there's going to be an endogenous channel by which that makes them more capital intensive. So that plays a non-trivial role. I have a paper on that, and Francesca Caselli with Jim Fayer have a nice paper on that too. All right, so that was just a little bit of accounting to say where are these differences in K over Y coming from. We can also talk about what they imply for the marginal product of capital. I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over that. So let me shift to human capital. Okay, so physical capital, important in absolute terms, not a big fraction of this massive difference in income. So now we're going to ride on human capital and see what that does. So the first approach I'm going to take is just all in on schooling. Imagine human capital as a function of schooling, and Mincer ran all these regressions that made us think what fits the data is log wages related to the level of schooling, and that's why this exponential relationship that fits the data better. But the Penrose table is using this piecewise linear thing. They're not using just a common coefficient on S. This could have been linear. Instead, it's piecewise linear. They're saying for the first 4 years of schooling, the elasticity or the semi-elasticity of 1 year of schooling raises human capital, say 13%, but that at higher levels of schooling, say between 4 and 8 years, only 10%. And then at even higher years, greater than 8, maybe only 7%. So there's this diminishing returns built into this piecewise linear formulation in human capital accumulation. Picture that at the level of an individual. And by the way, you could say, wait a minute, we don't have a single schooling level in a country. You could do this taking into account data on heterogeneity. Mark Bills and I and many others have done things like that. Okay, so, but this is what they do in the Penrose table to convert schooling data into human capital estimates. And it's empirically tied to these Mincer regressions. And you might wonder about those Mincer regressions. Are those causal? Does schooling cause higher wages? Well, that's where the credibility revolution comes in. David Card and many other people instrumenting for differences in schooling. And remarkably, the coefficients they get from IV Mincer are very similar to the OLS coefficients, at least on average. So that the OLS relationship that, think of like 1 year of schooling be associated with 10% higher wages, we're going to infer that means roughly 10% higher human capital. Okay. Again, they use this piecewise linear, but think of that in terms of magnitude, something like 1 year of schooling, 10% human capital differences. So if you do that, well, schooling is much higher in rich economies. This is a very strong relationship that rich economies have higher years of schooling. Picture at the high end numbers like 14, picture at the low end numbers like closer to 4 years of schooling. So maybe a 10-year difference in years of schooling across economies. Okay, so how does that feed into the development accounting? Actually, surprisingly small. Again, major in absolute terms, 70% difference in per capita income between the 90th percentile country and the 10th percentile country due to these schooling differences. Okay, so hugely important, then very important to understand where these differences in schooling come from. But that's not the end of the story. So let me, before I do that though, let me broaden from this 90th percentile perspective, this factor of 12, to look at all the countries at once. So let's do some accounting with that, with all the countries we have. So this is 117 countries in 2019. The first row just shows the variance in logs of these variables. The k over y is actually k over y raised to alpha over 1 minus alpha. Okay, so the variance of output happens to be about 1. So it's not normalized relative to that. It just happens to be the variance across countries of log per capita GDP is about 1. And so capital intensity, that's only about 0.14, so smaller. Human capital is even smaller, so it's kind of interesting that that's playing a bigger role in the accounting. And the reason is because it's more correlated with per capita income. So even though it's varying less, it's going to be generating a bigger contribution. And then the residual seems to be the biggest of all, the biggest variance of all. I don't love this first row as accounting because, as illustrated by physical versus human capital, we care about the correlation with per capita income. If the correlation was negative, the fact that there's variation in human capital is not really accounting in some sense. It's countries are, if rich countries had low human capital, they're rich despite the low human capital. So it matters, it's just not explaining why the rich countries are rich. So I care more about things like an elasticity. Here's the 90-10 ratio on this third row. That's what I already showed you. You can see the residual is this factor of almost 5. I'll say more about that in a second. But the elasticity is kind of my favorite row. So that's saying what it does is takes the k over y term, logs it, regresses it on log per capita income. You do that separately for these 3 terms. Well, these 3 terms add up to y over L. So that's because OLS is a linear operator, these 3 regression coefficients have to add up to 1 by construction. And there's 2 ways I like to think about these coefficients. One is just conditional expectation. If you have 1% higher, so let's say, 1% higher human capital in a country, how much higher income do you, it's the other way around. 1% higher income, how much higher human capital term do you expect? This says 0.22%. And you expect 0.14% higher K over Y and 0.64% higher A. So it looks like A is doing a lot of the work there. And this is then the connection. How much higher in the data human capital tends to be where income tends to be. Okay, so this implies human capital is a big part of the story. So one thing you could say is, development accounting looks like a very partial success. If 2/3, of income differences are unexplained, we've got a lot of work to do. So that can be exciting in terms of motivating research. We've got to figure out what's in that A. But we're not done. We're going to talk about some really interesting studies on human capital in a second. But let me also say, well, actually, one other thing about another way to interpret these coefficients is as a variance decomposition. It's just saying if you split the covariance terms equally, this is the variance of K over Y plus a share of the covariance divided by the variance of Y over L. So it has the covariance in it, so I like it more than the variance row at the top. Okay, so A is a measure of our ignorance, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but more on human capital next. Well, here's just saying the residual TFP. Before I say, hey, we have more to say on this, we're not done, let me make it sound like this is a big measure of ignorance. So I think Moses Abramovitz was famous for saying the TFP residual was a measure of our ignorance. We don't know what it is. So I'll talk about things that might contribute to it. But for now, I'll just say, look, it's highly correlated with per capita GDP. This is per worker snuck in there, which is fine because TFPs, per worker and per capita are very similar. Okay, but it's worse than this picture. This is a picture I got from Chad in his handbook chapter. This is his estimate, slightly different methodology, but the results are very similar. What share of the difference between each individual country in the United States? So it's a pairwise comparison. It's not a regression like I just ran or the 90-10. It's just a pairwise comparison to the United States. What share of the difference between each of these countries in the United States income comes from the TFP term? And you can see, that this 2/3 that I mentioned is hiding a lot of heterogeneity. The rich economy, TFP is explaining less than 2/3. So that means inputs are explaining most differences between, say, Singapore and Ireland and the United States, or France and the Netherlands, maybe half of the story. Whereas in the poorest countries of the world, which arguably we're most interested in, they have the lowest per capita income, the lowest consumption, so huge welfare gains from understanding where these low income levels come from. That's where our inputs are doing the least work. So that's in some sense, again, this is the low point in the talk in some sense of saying it looks like the development accounting is very limited in explaining, especially the countries we're most interested in understanding their relative income. Okay, it's not as bad as that, so let me say why. So there's been a bunch of papers since I and other people did this kind of Mitsarian schooling-based development accounting, and there's limits to that. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So let me talk about four important papers. And I'm gonna only talk about it briefly. I would have spent more time, but Todd's got a whole lecture with you, which he's a big player in this, as you're gonna see. But so are other people like David, who's with us here. Okay, so the first paper, Arosa, Korshkova, and Restucia, that was saying, hey, look, this formulation of schooling is the only input to human capital is limited even for schooling, in the sense that, you have textbooks, you have classrooms, you have, do you have access to computers or Chromebooks or iPads or whatever, just pencils and pens and paper and all that, uniforms. All those things may impact how much human capital you get from schooling. And rich countries have more of that. So they do make more investments in dollars in schooling, not just in the number of years that people are in school, and also the qualifications of the teachers. How much are you spending on that? So they take that into account and find, it's a quantitative theory paper but it's disciplined with a lot of data. You can explain much more of income differences than the simple accounting that's just years of schooling base would suggest. Okay, so that's quantitative theory, calibrated to a bunch of micro data. Todd Schulman reaches a similar conclusion from very different data. So what is he looking at? So he's looking at people in the United States and census data and asking whether this phi function, that phi of S function, looks the same in rich economies and poor economies. And the way he's trying to get at that is saying, in, say, the United States, you have people who've migrated from, say, Mexico versus Canada versus Sweden versus Japan and Finland, et cetera. So you've got people from all these different countries, and you can ask what a year of education in Mexico versus Switzerland, what that is worth in the US labor market. And he doesn't get a common phi of S function. He gets basically a higher return to a year of schooling if it's obtained in a rich economy than if it's attained in a developing country. So that suggests to him differences in the quality of schooling. That phi of S function needs to be different. We used a common one that was wrong. And he takes into account diminishing returns and more than you just see in this piecewise linear formulation. And what that does is that generates much bigger gaps in human capital across countries. And another bonus to Todd's formulation is it helps explain why rich countries have that high schooling. Remember, that plot was very strong that rich countries have more schooling levels. Well, why? A deeper level of accounting, the next layer is to say, where are those coming from? And Todd's proposing an explanation, which is the schools are better. We're investing in more schools, better teachers, better materials, and so on. So that's inducing more schooling because it's making schooling more remunerative in terms of the human capital gain and the wage gain you can garner in rich economies compared to relatively poor economies. Okay, so very different data. A model also gets much bigger role for human capital differences than you get in the simple Mincerian schooling formulation. And then a more recent paper uses very different data. Well, I should say very different data to measure get at this object. This is by Lutz, Hendricks, and Todd again. And then they look at people who've migrated and surveys that ask them what they earned in their country of origin. So the beauty of that is that now you're basically looking at the same worker in the jump that they get. So if their human capital came with them, then all of the jump in their income has to be attributed to the other terms. So you can get at the human capital term by saying, how much do you not increase? How much do you not close the gap when you migrate? So people from Mexico to the United States double their wages, but that's not as big as the factor of 3 difference in income between the United States and Mexico. So in that case, it would explain, in their view, 2/3 would come from other forces like physical capital and residual TFP. But when they do this, they get more than you get from the Mincerian accounting. Again, very different approach in terms of data, but they get a much bigger role for human capital. And then there's another limit to schooling and looking at schooling. These first 3 papers are all about effectively the quality of schooling differing across countries, so that the Mincerian approach of schooling needs to be broadened to incorporate that. But what about investments? You could talk about investments before school, investments after school. I could have cited Emmanuel and Shashadri paper, which like Arosa, Korshkova, and Restucia, is quantitative theory, and that they emphasize human capital accumulated preschool, in school, after school. So things like parents' investment in nutrition and in medical care, all the growing up. That's something that's going to contribute to human capital differences. And then there's what happens after you leave school, what happens on the job. And so this very nice paper by David with Ben Mall, Tommaso Porzio, Nancy Chen, and Todd again, that very nice paper says, people seem to have faster wage growth on the job in rich economies than they do in developing countries. And so that is consistent with more human capital is accumulated on the job, that their human capital is growing faster on the job, and therefore that's also contributing to income differences across countries. Okay, so Todd's going to go into this in more detail. David might talk about some of it too. Well, I guess, yeah, somebody else is doing the labor studies talk, so maybe not. Okay, but if you revisit the development accounting, you can get a much bigger role for human capital and much smaller role for TFP. So I'm going to put a range here because there's a lot of research still to be done. These are great papers, but there's room for more to pin down more what these relationships look like. So an example for why I'm not necessarily going to say these high-end estimates are 100% right, we've nailed it, is that, for example, wage growth on the job, we need to understand where that's coming from. So that paper was important in documenting that and said it could reflect human capital accumulation, but it could be something more like workers are apprenticing, so they're not entirely working early on. So a bunch of the wage growth could be human capital growth, yes, but also growth in how much they went from watching and learning to actually working. And there's also things like the reason wages might grow rapidly in advanced economies might be the technology is more advanced. There's more to learn. In a way, that's kind of like a bad thing. You need to spend all this time working just to use the technology. Obviously, it's worth it, or else you wouldn't do it. But there's a sense in which it's not clear whether that's entirely a human capital term or entirely a technology. So that's why I'm still putting the range in here. But these papers give us a lot of encouragement that human capital is really important, might be the single most important factor in explaining income differences across countries. Picture this is like, the square root of, this is about, between 3 and 4. So this is easily in the range of half of that story. And then we'd have some contribution from capital intensity and maybe a minor contribution from this residual TFP. So clearly a priority then is to understand, is this number at the low end, is it the high end, and importantly, what's contributing to it. All right, so now let me talk about TFP differences. So I would say 4 potential contributors to these TFP differences. I slipped and called it technology residual. That's not right. It has a bunch of things in it. So I'm going to argue misallocation could be attributed to that. You can also think of natural resources. Something that's not in the capital stock measure here is just, do you have a lot of endowment? Do you have a lot of oil in the ground? Do you have a lot of great land for growing crops? That'll show up in the TFP residual, right? That's not in human capital. It's not in hours worked. It's not in equipment or structures, which is how we measure the K. So as a result of that, a lot of natural resources, a lot of countries are rich due to natural resources, and that's going to contribute to the A residual. And then there's measurement error. It's boring, but it's the reality, right? Every term here can be measured with error. GDP, I showed you the broad conceptual thing of what they're doing with PPP. You could do chain weighting. There's lots of things you could do that might improve on that, that might give us differences in GDP. Okay, we don't measure hours worked per worker very well outside the rich economy, so this is clearly measured with error. Physical capital, how are we bringing in infrastructure capital? That's typically included. Is that the right way to just treat it like we treat private capital? So there's some interesting papers on that. As I mentioned, there's a lot of work to be done figuring out exactly how to measure human capital. And so mismeasurement in any of these components is going to necessarily flow into this residual. Okay. Let me say a little bit about misallocation then. So TFPR is an important concept in misallocation. So instead of TFP, which would be some real measure of like output per unit of inputs, this is a revenue-based measure. So it's got prices in it. So why would we want prices in our measure of TFP? Don't we want something real? Well, prices, remember, are the local valuations of the products, whether it's consumer goods or producer goods. And so the gaps in TFPR, they exist across firms or plants, even within narrow industries, within economies. And so those gaps could reflect differences in the value of the marginal product. These are average products, revenue divided by input. That's an average product. But if marginal products are proportional to average products, then the value of these marginal products would differ too. And that's kind of like the Adam Smith deficiency condition, as you equate the ratio of marginal products to marginal utilities. So if marginal products aren't equated, so like the cost of the input to society, the wage would be common, and so the value of the marginal product of labor should be common in an efficient economy. That's an efficiency condition, just like equating marginal rates of substitution in production or utility to relative prices, that's an efficiency condition. So these TFPR gaps, if they're real, if they're not just measurement error, they could reflect differences in the values of marginal products and therefore a misallocation. So the bigger these gaps are, the more the market's failing to arbitrage these differences. And so if you think about it, it means that you could reallocate capital from a low value marginal product firm or product to a high value marginal product firm, and that would actually increase output. So you have the exact same aggregate capital stock, but just by rearranging it across activities, you increase output. So it'll show up in TFP. So that means the gaps themselves, the fact that they're not being arbitraged away, is dragging down aggregate TFP. That's the essence by which misallocation can contribute to TFP differences. And Rastush and Rajarson were the first to me to point out. I mean, it's all of economics to point out misallocation is what we care about. We care about allocative efficiency, but they pointed out that these gaps might be large. Lots of policies or market failures could contribute to them. So things like market power. Market differences across firms and products could contribute to these differences. So that's like a market failure. Markdowns, monopoly power in the labor market, financial frictions, or even market power, or even state-owned banks choosing to allocate capital toward state-owned enterprises or politically favored sectors or firms. That could deal differences in these marginal products and generate differences in TFP across countries. So is this happening? Well, Chang and I studied US versus China and India. We were particularly interested in China and India because they're relatively poor, relatively big too, a lot of stakes involved, but also because they had a lot of government policies, but a lot of state-owned enterprise in China, including state-owned banks, a lot of state-owned banks in India, a lot of licensing restrictions on what firms could do that might generate misallocation. And India is famous for firing restrictions that could impede the reallocation of labor across firms. So notice this is looking across firms within an industry. The US already has big differences, a factor of 2 almost between the 90th and 10th percentile firms. And that's kind of like differences in profitability. It's not that surprising, right? We know, Walmart made more money than Kmart. Kmart went out of business. A lot of mom and pops are being driven out. So we know gaps exist even in the United States. Those could be adjustment costs, but they could also be things like markup differences that might reflect misallocation. Or, in China, they could be, state-owned enterprises getting subsidized. And so in China and India, we see bigger gaps. So that's consistent with less allocative efficiency in China and India than in the United States. Okay. And we find it contributes in a non-trivial way. So this adds some countries. So this is 30 countries. So it hasn't been studied as much as I would like. I would wish there had been 300 studies, not 30. And the relationship isn't as tight as it could be, but there's a positive slope. So countries with high TFP tend to have higher allocative efficiency, where you calculate it as how much is your output relative to the output if you close those gaps and those values of the TFPR gaps across firms. So the US is not perfectly allocative efficient. It's roughly 75% or so. And then you see other countries tend to have lower allocative efficiency, and it tends to be the lower the TFP, the lower the allocative efficiency. Okay, so at face value, you could run this regression, get a coefficient of 0.4 and say 40% of TFP differences are due to misallocation. There's a bunch of caveats to that, so I wouldn't say that, but it does at least provide us some encouragement to say there's a bunch of market failures and government policies that might be contributing to these gaps that we could think about policy reforms that might help address. It might cause increases in output. And again, that might be the story or an important contributor to, say, China's rapid growth. It might not be just that they increased human capital, just that they increased physical capital, their inputs, the standard development accounting, but also they reduced the role of state-owned enterprises, which have really low TFPR. The state-owned enterprises have really low TFPR in China, and they become much less important. The economy has moved in a major way toward private enterprises with much higher and much smaller TFPR gaps between them. Okay. What about technology? I'll just say a little bit about technology. I like to make one broad comment because sometimes people say, hey, technology flows across countries. Like if you go back to this accounting, they might say, look, people can't move, so the H can't move in the L. K, physical capital could move, but there might be restrictions on that, capital controls, risk differences, exchange rate risk, et cetera, expropriation risk, taxation, all that stuff. So there might be some limited mobility of K, but sometimes you hear the argument, if it's technology, it can flow. It can flow because it's embodied in equipment, you can import it. It can flow if it's embodied in firms through multinationals. I think Natalia Raimondo is going to talk about that. She's done some pioneering work on the importance of multinationals and income differences across countries. And she's got a really nice paper looking at that very thing. What's productivity of multinationals when they operate in different economies? So you can see them carrying their productivity and their technology. Okay, so it's sometimes argued ideas can flow. Imagine it's not even embodied in a firm or a piece of equipment or a specialized material. It's just an idea, like a management practice. Well, everybody can adopt that. Well, my colleague Nick Bloom says they don't. Management practices aren't pursued equally everywhere. And more generally, you can say, look, if technology could flow perfectly across space or across, economies, then maybe it should be able to flow perfectly within economies, and we don't see that. We see companies going out of business because they don't have the same technology as other firms do. So I think that there is reason to think that technology can differ not only across countries, but across firms. Okay, so the one thing I wanted to say about it, though, was I have a paper with Chang-Tai Hsieh that looks at firms over the life cycle. We looked at only 3 economies, but people have filled this in with more economies since then. And so what this figure shows is at the bottom level, we've normalized entrance at 1 in terms of employment. And you can see that as they age on this horizontal axis, they tend to get bigger to a little extent in India, to a modest extent in Mexico, and to a great extent in the United States. So they're growing by a factor of 10 in the United States. Now, some of this is selection, but that happens everywhere. Exit is lower for bigger enterprises. So part of why they're getting bigger is just the survivors were bigger than the ones who exited. But the survivors are also growing, and that's what's generating the gap here. Survivors grow much faster in the United States than in Mexico and India. It turns out the US is kind of an outlier on the high side, and India is an outlier on the downside. But this pattern suggests that maybe firms are investing in more in the United States post-entry. So they improve their technology, improve their products, develop more locations. So that process seems to be different in developing economies, and we need to understand how that's contributing to maybe technology differences across countries. Okay, let me move on. The last thing I want to end with, I guess I have about 6 minutes left. The last thing I want to talk about is that I wouldn't want you to come away from this saying we're obsessed with GDP, because we're not. We're obsessed with welfare. Economists are narrow, not as people, well, maybe as people too, but even as people, we marry, we have kids, we love people other than ourselves. Economists are famous for saying people are selfish, but we don't have them that selfish. We have them, or at least broad selfish. We have them we're not caring only about income, but actually consumption and leisure time, and whether they're even alive. So this formulation says, look, economists' narrow economic view would still have people care about the present discounted value over their life of their flow utility. So we need to take several steps away from income to think about welfare. Now, I'm not going to think about utils. I'm going to think about, I'm going to put in a particular functional form for a utility, flow utility, additively separable to make things add up. And this via val is going to be a constant elasticity formulation. I'm going to assume, just to make progress for many countries, log normally distributed consumption, but with microdata, you can relax that. And so Chad and I and other people have done work. Of course, lots of people have done work documenting consumption differences within economies. You can actually see what this distribution looks like. But for expositional clarity, let's just make these strong assumptions. C bar is expected C. If you do that, you can actually, and then you do this thought experiment of 2 economies, and this should have a U sub 0 for present discounted value utility, expected utility. You get a life expectancy term. You can decompose it with this consumption equivalent welfare. So what is this doing? Now I'm using I for country, sorry. And we're comparing it to the US. So this is flow utility in the US, potentially with everybody's consumption scaled up if lambda is greater than 1 or down. And I is another comparison country. Think of, say, France. And so lambda I would be saying, how much do I need to scale up or down everyone's consumption in the US? Because I'm holding fixed sigma, which is determining the dispersion of consumption within the US. And the bars are meaning we're only looking at average leisure here. But you could have another term here, which is dispersion and leisure. So lambda is like consumption equivalent welfare differences between the US and, say, a comparison country, say France. If lambda was greater than 1, that's like saying you have to raise consumption in the United States to make people as better off as they are in France. If lambda is less than 1, that's saying people in France are less well off. Okay, and then we can decompose these lambda differences into life expectancy differences, into average consumption differences, average leisure differences, and inequality differences. And it turns out, and then we put some numbers on it. I'm going to skip over that real quick. So what do we find? Well, on the one hand, GDP is very highly correlated with this welfare measure. Per capita GDP differences with these welfare differences above 0.9. But there are differences. Welfare is not GDP. So Europe looks closer to the United States because they have higher life expectancy, higher leisure, and less inequality. And so instead of being 80% of the US per capita income, there's something like US per capita income. So the US shouldn't have a superiority complex vis-a-vis Western Europe or because of its higher per capita income and even higher per capita consumption, because there are other things that are better in Europe than the United States. Okay, so broader welfare measure says Europe's much closer to the United States. They're all kind of comparably rich, but in different ways. Developing countries actually look farther behind because in addition to low consumption, they have low life expectancy and tend to have higher inequality. And then if you look over time, you see rising life expectancy is an important contributor to growth. But I'm more focused on these welfare level differences here. And all these results are robust if you look carefully at microdata and take into account actual heterogeneity in income and consumption, not just assume log normal and things like that. Okay, so I think in the last thing, I'll show you a plot on this. These are welfare differences, and these are GDP per capita differences. The U.S. normalized to 1 for both. So here it's illustrating it that at the top, these countries are typically above the 45-degree line. That's saying they're closer in welfare to the US than they are in GDP, right? And some countries are clearly higher than the US, clearly above 1. And then in developing countries, they start to pull down, meaning they're below the 45-degree line. And that's the lower life expectancy and higher inequality is contributing to that. You can see some countries stand out, like South Africa, a long way from the 45-degree line, because there's so much inequality in South Africa. So South Africa and Botswana, relatively rich economies within sub-Saharan Africa, but also very unequal. And unfortunately, hit in a major way by the AIDS epidemic in a way that lowered their welfare. So whereas their per capita income would have them something like 1/4 of U.S. per capita income, the welfare is below 1/16. That's how important these differences in life expectancy are and differences in inequality are. So this is really driving home that we really care about welfare. We care about income differences to the extent that they contribute to welfare. They're highly correlated. You see that, the 45-degree line, these countries are hugging the 45-degree line. On the other hand, it's not the whole story. These are economically important deviations that we care about a lot. And one of them is inequality. As like I was saying, the aggregate view is very important motivationally. It's cross-country inequality. We also care a lot about within-country inequality. That's another important welfare topic within macro development is what policies can efficiently reduce inequality within economies, not just across economies. But the welfare stakes involved in this are enormous. So I'm really happy and this plot shows, these are major gaps these are ratio of welfare to income. Some economies have 40% higher welfare than they do relative income, and some economies have less than half the relative welfare that they do relative income. So these gaps, these other factors matter a ton. So massive differences, final comment, massive differences in per capita income. And there's other things, inequality within economies, life expectancy, leisure that matter too. And I will stop there and open it up for Q&A.
Excellent, Pete. Thanks so much for this terrific lecture. Let me just start by saying I've given a bunch of lectures in development accounting in my life. I'm not sure I've seen too many, so it was a pleasure to see all this material that's familiar in a new light. So during your lecture, you were probably unaware of this. There was 39 questions answered, and
Okay.
attempt to answer all
Great.
of them.
Love the engagement.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of engagement. I was hoping we could call on a few people and in the front row. So
should I stop sharing or keep that?
What's that?
Should I stop sharing or keep the slides?
Yeah, you can stop sharing, I think. Yeah. So Mohammed Reza, I don't know if you're still around. You were asking a couple of questions. Do you want to unmute if you're still here and ask one of them? He raised his hand. Okay, so I may have to promote him to the front row. Attendees. Okay, allowed to talk. Okay, you should be able to talk. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the lecture. My first question, why this particular production function you choose, and how much the choice of the production function matters on the contributions of each factor.
So there is heterogeneity, as I mentioned, in the like alpha. So that Cobb-Douglas functional form is just very commonly used because we see relatively stable capital income shares in many countries over many time periods. It's not necessary for that. You just need labor augmenting technology terms to get relatively stable shares. So that's a stronger assumption than you actually need to get that. But that's the reason it's often used. And it's simple. We could have more parameters, but then we got to estimate those parameters. So for example, the substitutability between capital and labor is one, and we don't think it is actually one. But there's not dozens of estimates in dozens of countries of what that elasticity of substitution is. So if I had to say, I would say it's probably less than one. I haven't seen an argument that it's contributing in an important way to development accounting, but I haven't seen that studied. So that's an open area for somebody to pursue. So people have pursued the alpha differences, and they contribute in a modest way to differences. So that's why I felt comfortable abstracting from that.
So Yannick, you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. Very interesting lecture. Thank you for that. I have just a couple of questions. First of all, it's a kind of follow-up question from what the previous speaker asked. How robust are the results according to the position of A? I mean the TFP, because in your presentation it's like kind of link with H, but in some papers they attach it like kind of the first letter in the production function. And then I'm just asking myself, do you have like different kind of result according to how you consider the, let's say the technology or TPF, TFP, sorry. That's my first question. The second question is about the alpha. You consider, I mean, in the literature, people are still considering alpha equal to 1/3. And my question is like, are we supposed to keep taking 1/3 over the time forever? Or maybe, I don't know, since while I've been reading 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, how can we convince people 1/3 is like the normal number to consider? So thank you.
No, you're welcome. So I'm not sure I understood exactly the first one, but to the extent that we're unsure of the contributions of, say, human capital in particular, and some of the estimates are a lot, that would mean there's less role for the productivity residual. So I would say that's still very active uncertainty about how much the technology term is contributing. And like you said, it depends on the country, and it depends on the data you use, and it depends on the production function you use. I would say the key thing is the uncertainty about the human capital term. That's the major source of uncertainty we have about how important this residual, this unexplained stuff is. And in terms of the alpha, I would say it's not 1/3 everywhere. It's not, and this is again a fiction to have this aggregate production function. So a nice paper by Devash Raval and Ezra Oberfield, for example, emphasizes that the economy has all this distribution of, even if every firm had a Cobb-Douglas, they don't have the same alpha. Different industries, but also firms within different industries have different alphas. So underlying this simple aggregate production function is a lot of richness. And so when shocks happen in the economy, that's going to endogenously change the importance of relative firms and relative industries and change alpha. So like in the United States, we've seen labor go from like 2/3 to closer to 60% in the last couple of decades. So I don't think it's constant over time. So it's not constant, underneath the aggregate. It's not constant across firms or industries, but also over time, it's not constant within economies. So we see important differences. And I kind of just swept those under the rug because they're not as important as the parts that I did talk about. It might be, more important than the labor term, than the intensive labor term, but it's not as important as the physical capital term or certainly not the human capital term. So that's why I demoted it in this talk, but yeah, it's something where there's a bunch of richness behind that. So I don't think of that as like this Planck's constant that never moves across country or time. I think about it as endogenously moving in interesting ways, in ways we can measure too.
Great. So there was another question about human capital. Jun Sup, do you want to ask your question? Oh, I see. Shui, you're asking question too. It's hard to keep this. There's a lot of different. Okay, Jun Sup, allowed to talk. Go for it, Jun Sup. Should be able to talk now.
Yes. So I asked the same question. I don't know if I pressed the wrong button, but okay.
We
So
can hear you.
You can't hear me?
We can. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. My question was that let's say the returns to the human capital actually could depend on other variables, such as in some countries, there could be a large supply of human capital, workers, but then there are not many firms that with high technology or capital, good quality capital that they can work at to have a good returns from their human capital. So I was wondering if there's any framework that answers to that, and David already answered to that, very well. And yes, that was my question there. Yes.
Yeah, I think my talk didn't do that justice because it just had like multiplicative A with H. So they may be tied up in a really interesting way. And there's some papers on that say, more human capital means you can use more advanced technology. And that may be a critical reason why people are motivated to acquire more human capital. So that may be the Mansarian return is tied to the A you can use is tied to your level of human capital. Whereas the way I wrote it down is everybody, regardless of their age, can use the A, and that doesn't fit the data. We see, and consistent with what you're saying, we see that when firms adopt technology, they tend to upskill at the same time. So if they automate their factory, the workers that remain tend to be higher skill. So there's tons of evidence for that complementarity, and that functional form doesn't do that justice. There's some nice work by Thomas Sampson, Ezra Oberfield, Grossman, and Helpman that talks about this complementarity between education and capital. Maybe capital is a form of embodied technology, and that might explain, some movements in labor share this complementarity. Which again, my functional form kind of ignored that. So I think there's a lot of evidence consistent with what you're saying, and we need more modeling and more data work on that. But I guess you could also say there's a lot of micro development work on that too, that more educated farmers are likely to adopt hybrid seeds and more advanced agricultural technology. Yeah.
Great. Xiangyu, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Dr. Peter Klenow. I'm actually a big fan of you. I have actually two correlated questions I would like to say. First of all, I'm thinking about how to conceptually define what is capital. Let's think about, do you think that like intangible capital is some kind of capital, or only like in the financial report of some firm, only PP&E? So my first question is how to like measure or conceptually define what is capital in such kind of gross accounting. And my second question is it seems to me that naturally different kinds of countries have different kind of capital that rich countries may have more like robots to substitute labor, and maybe poor country may have more tools to complement labor. I don't know, will it somehow bias the gross accounting procedure? Yeah, that is my question.
Okay, so on the first question, I'm actually not sure of this, but I'm going to conjecture that the capital measure in the Penn Rule table does not have intangibles, or at least not in a consistent way across economies. I would be surprised at that. So, but you've nicely brought up one of my pet peeves, which is I don't want to lump intangible capital with PP&E. And the reason is because I think it has different economic properties. I think things like intellectual properties, like R&D type activities, that's arguably showing up in the technology term. So I don't want to actually the constant returns to scale is like saying, hold fixed the technology, double your inputs, and you can double your output. Well, if you increase your intangible capital, that's arguably increasing the A term, and it's a source of increasing returns to scale. So my pet peeve is when people put it in the PP&E and treat it constant returns to scale. But I think you're right to make that distinction and say, we are increasingly using intangible capital data to think about firms having intellectual property that's contributing to their markups and contributing. It's a part of the technology. It's the way I like to think about it. And then your second one, I think that's totally fair to say you have different levels of automation in different economies, and how does this accounting deal with that? Not well. It could show up in the alpha. So in certain task-based models, if you automate, then you'll have a different capital share. So I think that's true in, say, agriculture. Advanced economies have much more capital intensive, so they have a higher capital share, higher alpha in their agriculture than a very labor-intensive agriculture, or comparatively labor-intensive agriculture. So that's where the common alpha term would abstract away from that. But I think there's other ways. It doesn't necessarily have to just show up as alpha. There's other ways this complementarity, or the different types of technology used, wouldn't just show up as more K. So I think that's totally fair. The way I like to think about it, and this is very influenced by work that Chad Jones and Ben Jones have done, is I like to think about there's not that much substitutability, less than you see in the Cobb-Douglas between capital and labor, so that when we accumulate more capital over time, that would actually be pushing down capital share because we can't use it very effectively. And where automation comes in is it soaks up this capital. And so one of the reasons capital share was relatively stable for a long time is we had these two offsetting forces of automation that were pushing down labor share, and we're abundant in capital, which was tending to push up labor share. So I think there is some richness that I'm missing about things like automation in the simple production function. Yep.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Shui, you had some questions. Some were quite related to Xiangyu's questions, but do you want to unmute? And if you have any remaining questions, you can go for it.
Thank you for the talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think my question is somewhat related to the previous question on the intangible capital. So I think now it's more standard when we look at development accounting, and it was using intangible capital only. But is there a good data source when we want to look at intangibles across countries, especially PPP, capital-specific PPPs for intangibles, I guess? And my second question related to the human capital measure. So I think you've talked about how we can construct a human capital measure from return to schooling, but there is also another way of construct the so-called quality adjusted labor input, which you kind of calculate labor service, then remove the hours. Like, I'm wondering what's the difference between these two methods, and like which one should be probably a better one when we want to do the development accounting, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So the first one I don't have a good answer to, which is I don't know of a good data source on intangible capital across countries. So sorry to say that. So I'm glad you asked another question, because I think I have a better answer to that. So you're right, there's a growth accounting tradition of saying we're going to have quality adjusted labor services, which is basically like a Divizia index, like saying, let's look at different levels of education, or also different groups, in terms of like men versus women and so on. And even, sector and stuff like that. So they put people into all these different bins. And if one bin is higher wage and we move people into that bin, then that's going to get higher production weight, because of the higher wage and the higher factor share to that factor. If we move people from the low education bin to the high education bin, that's going to contribute to growth in the growth accounting. And that is actually consistent with the Mansarian approach, but like more detailed. It's like allowing more flexibility. That functional form that I was imposing on the 5S, that was nice in the sense that it was saved on data. It was data. It was a simple approach when we don't have a ton of data. But if you had data on the distribution of schooling across countries and the wage bill shares of these different groups with different schooling or different experience levels in different industries and so on, then you could do the Divizia index approach. And you're 100% right. You can do that across countries, just like you could do it in development accounting, just like you do it over time within an economy. So I think that's actually a richer approach when you have more data to implement it.
So
Thank you.
so we're out of time. Let me conclude by just making a couple of points related to some of the Q&A and the answers that that were typed in. There was a bunch of measurement questions about human capital in general. There were questions about the shadow economy. You know, Pete talked about welfare. You know, consumption's really low in poor countries. Look, I mean, I'm sure it's low. You know, maybe we're missing huge swaths of the economy that's kind of unmeasured. So this is, you know, this is kind of exactly the kind of thing we're going to take up in some of the future lectures. We have Todd Schulman talking about human capital data. We have Julieta Caunedo talking about agriculture data. You know, lots of people grow food in the backyard and then they eat it. Maybe they sell a little bit. You know, is that in GDP? Is that not in GDP? To what extent do we believe those data? You know, who knows what the national income accounts are doing? We have Talib Chilik, who's from the World Bank, and he runs the living standards measurement surveys, you know, that are exactly designed to go think about all the stuff that you produce as a farmer in a low income country, whether or not that's sold in a market. Pete mentioned Nataya's work on multinationals. I mean, a number of these issues are going to come up over and over in the following question. So just because we can't answer them all today, actually, even in the whole course, we're not going to answer all of them. We're hoping some of the future lectures inspire you guys to go out and help get better answers. The labor share one, Doug Gollan's paper, it's a great paper. Doug just left. Shows labor share is not that different across countries. It's also 20 years old and has only a smattering of countries. I mean, I do think that's kind of a topic that we can delve into again. So there's a bunch of examples of other good questions that we didn't quite get to, but we'll get to them later in the course. So thanks everybody for attending. Thanks again, Pete, for that outstanding lecture to start off our series. It was terrific. We will make the slides available. We'll make the recording available. And we're also now going to break for spring break. There's no class next week. There's a class 2 weeks from now. I forgot to mention, huge measurement issues in these data, and Akos Valentini's lecture in part's going to talk about some of those measurement issues. He's going to talk about sectoral differences in outputs and inputs and sectoral patterns. I mean, the sectoral patterns drive a lot of the questions in macro development, and we're gonna get to delve into that immediately in the next class, which is not the following Friday, the one after that. So thanks everybody for coming. See you in a couple weeks.
Thanks.